Welcome to the Property Nomads podcast, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Grant. Chris has a plethora of knowledge, both in estate management, also from an energy performance point of view. Chris graduated and got his first job as an estate agent in East London and rapidly progressed to being branch manager. From there, moved into commercial agency, specialising in licensed property market. Played a key role in the beer orders, which saw UK breweries selling off huge tranches of their pub estates to various investment companies. After that, he got straight into building his own portfolio. He started with a nice flip and has amassed an investment portfolio worth in excess of £10 million. Chris, thank you for taking time out today. I understand we're breaking your podcast virginity, if you don't mind me saying so.
Correct, Rob. Yeah, this is the first time. So, apologies if I'm slightly nervous or stuttering over my words, but I'll do my best and hopefully impart some of my experience in property over to your listeners.
Thank you, and really looking forward to this. And people that would have noticed that we've titled this along the lines of rent to rent and rent to rent serviced accommodation being a ticking time bomb, and we'll go into that in a minute. It'd be good to get your thoughts again with your experience in the industry. But before we do that, because everyone likes to get started in property, talk us through that very first deal that you've done, that very first flip, and how you've managed to grow into having such a large portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd left the corporate environment. I'd sort of clocked up 5-6 years in estate agency. What I'd noticed certainly during the work that I was doing under the beer order, so we were advising a Japanese bank who were buying up these huge estates. And I mean, the situation in terms of pubs in particular has worsened really because they're shutting at a phenomenal rate. But a lot of the portfolio they were buying were ripe for development. We've all seen, multiple pubs now converted into flats, particularly ones with large areas of land, car parks, where you just end up seeing the whole pub demolished and sort of small housing estates built there. So that was really where I sort of got some flavour for development, but certainly being on the other side of it as an estate agent, I was dealing with lots of developers in East London. East London, typically a marketplace with lots of rundown properties. We'd often be selling probate sales, properties. In fact, I bought myself without any basic bathroom facilities, still with an outside toilet. So, I had a reasonable flavour for the marketplace and also the profits that could be made from that. So when we'd come to the end of the work I was doing in the license sector, still a relatively young man, lots of energy and passion for property, I made that decision to go out by myself and to see if I could make a living doing it. And I was very fortunate at the time, although sort of 27,000, which was the purchase price of that first property, wasn't a great deal of money by sort of modern standards. For me at the time, it was. I was very fortunate to tap up my late father for a chunk of that money. Convinced him that I could magically turn it into profit overnight, and lo and behold, that was the case. I approached an agent having seen the property advertised. Still remember exactly where it is. It's just on Barking Road, very close to the home of the mighty West Ham United, or it was at the time. And I can almost still picture the property. And it was really at that stage very much because I didn't have builders around me at the time that could have undertaken a refurb. It was really a case of going in there, clearing out what was in there, just sort of tidying the place up a little bit, still very old fashioned, and put it back on the market with a different agent, and managed to get it under offer and show myself a decent profit, certainly more than I'd been earning, as a monthly salary as an employee, and I'd made it sort of much quicker and for a greater amount. So that at that point I was I'd got the bug, I was hooked. I still had lots of agency contacts in East London at the time, which did me a few favours. The only thing to overcome there was the last time that I dealt with all of these agents was really when I was a work colleague or an agent in the same marketplace. Quite a transition to make to be able to approach them again and say, look, I'm on the buying side now, I've got cash. Oh, Chris, have you got cash? Where's that come from? I haven't got the cash to do it myself. But once you sort of start to prove yourself with the agent, then you've got that foot in the door. And when you move on to the refurb side of it, obviously I'd give them the resales, so they'd be earning twice on any one property. So that's how I sort of built the connections and the relationships that I did at the time.
Always good to know in terms of, again, with the power team, the network, and these sorts of things, because these are things that you hit, regardless of where you are in property. It's all about not necessarily what you know, but who you know, which is good. And over time, you've built up a portfolio that's, say, worth over £10 million. Now, again, that's great, and congratulations. Some people that are listening to this might only just be getting started in property, and they might think that 10 million is so far off. So if you can, how did you just build that up? Did you change strategy, or was it just a case of testing yourself, wanting to do bigger or better things? Now, how did you tackle that?
Yeah, so I think you have to find a balance really, because in terms of maintaining cash flow, obviously you can't keep everything. Back in when I started, if you bought at the right price, which I was thankful to always be able to do, you could undertake your refurbishment work and pretty much, if you did want to retain that property, pretty much pull all of your money back out of it by refinancing on the enhanced property value. I was probably one of the first borrowers for Paragon when they entered into the market, and I'm still quite loyal to them now. They had some fantastic refurb products at the time that could effectively forward value the property prior to purchase and starting work on it. So I had a great relationship with their local valuer as well. So I was always pulling my money out. So if it was something that had been refurbed to a decent standard, if it's sold within normally sort of 6 to 8 weeks, which in the right market it should do, or certainly be under offer, fantastic, then it would be sold and I'd have money back in the bank. If it didn't sell beyond that point, my policy was always at that point to have rented it out. So I'd refinance it again, still able to pull my money back out, but move on to the next one. So that property portfolio is kind of, in many ways, legacy property that hadn't sold over the years. And even the buy-to-let market in those days was, relatively new. There was a rental demand, but it certainly wasn't as regulated, as we see now. So that was the strategy, really, always being able to pull my money back out, maintaining my capital, and to grow on that, and then with capital appreciation over sort of the 20 odd years I've been doing it, I've seen that sort of growth. I mean, the portfolio has probably been at its peak, probably closer to about 15 million, but I've trimmed it over the years. There's things I've got rid of that weren't performing as well as I could have done, and that sort of brought me into where I am now.
That's fantastic. And again, I really like that, because that's a case of, if I've heard this correctly, that you've always, you make your money when you buy, which I think you've highlighted. You've always gone into it with 2 exit strategies. So sell ideally, if not, then, still refinance and then rent out. And you've been consistent at it, which is incredibly important, no matter what the economic circumstances are. It just seems that you've been very consistent, and then, as you say, legacy over the last 20 years or so, voila, a bit of capital well, I imagine quite a lot of capital appreciation, given where those properties are based, and then that's why you could be sat here saying 7-8 figures, because all I've done is I've done one, and I've just pretty much repeated that process, always having your exit strategies.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Robbie. It's interesting you mentioned the area in which I've operated, which is obviously having been born in East London. I've kind of stuck to what I knew. And I think what was transformational in terms of the capital growth that I've achieved was the announcement for the Olympics. So I was born probably less than 10 minutes away from the current where the Olympic Stadium stands now, or the home to the mighty West Ham. And I remember sitting in my office at the time when we was waiting for the announcement. So Olympics 2012, probably there's always a good couple of years lead time. So it would have been probably like sort of late 2009. I remember sitting in my office and the president of the Olympic Committee announcing the city of London. And I always remember exactly how he said it with a French accent. And really at that point, I knew that what I was sitting on was, yeah, listen, it had value in it then. But in terms of that regeneration that was about to happen across East London. I mean, if you go to Stratford now, you literally wouldn't recognise it. Somebody likened it to Dubai the other day, which I think is a little bit ambitious, but certainly in terms of the volume of skyscrapers that are there, it's not a million miles off on a sunny day looking in the right direction. So again, that kind of reinforces that, if you are able to tap into what is likely to be an up and coming area, with me, it was probably slightly more luck than judgment. But, doing enough research, you will find those areas, whether it's rail line extensions, Crossrail, the DLR, HS2, all of these things, have to be on your investment radar if you're looking for medium to longer term growth.
Yeah, the fundamentals, as I would say, HS2, that's until they start building it and then decide not to build it, and then they might do, but I'm being facetious, but I like my railways. But I point taken. Again, look at your fundamentals with all of this. So a bit of a U-turn, or bit of a curve, or whatever. So with rent to rent and rent to rent serviced accommodation. Now you're in the part of the court where you are saying it's a ticking time bomb, and there's other people out there that will disagree with that. There's other people that are going to agree with that. So let's dive into that. First of all, what is it? What is rent to rent, for those that aren't familiar, and why do you think it's a ticking time bomb?
Okay, so I discovered this in some ways by chance. I think it was probably via a Facebook property forum that was entitled R2R and R2SA. There's all these acronyms I didn't fully understand. So I did some research and then realized what it was. And essentially, if you own a property, you can enter into an arrangement with a third party who will effectively re-rent out that property. So that property is handed over to them almost wholesale, everything bar the title. They then in theory, they then take on full responsibility for renting that out. So they would agree a rent with you for, let's say, £2,000 a month for a house, as you would expect. They would then be renting that out at a higher level via various different means. So it could be just the fact that you as the owner of the property have been offered, guaranteed management or no hassle sort of letting for the property, and off the back of that you've accepted a lower rent. Or it could be that the individual that's taken that rent has seen the opportunity to rent it out as individual rooms or for short-term accommodation, Airbnb. But ultimately, they'll be profiting beyond it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be offering you the deal in the first place. So that's essentially what it is. So you see it advertised as R2R or R2SA, which is serviced accommodation. So that would mean that whatever agreement you had in place, that would give license then to that individual to re-rent out your property. And I think my biggest concern with that is twofold, really. It will possibly work for some people, particularly if you don't have the opportunity to actively manage your own properties. So I still manage all of my own properties. I use selected agents in some case, but I've got a great maintenance team around me. I appreciate not everybody's in the position to do that, so it may seem attractive. I think where the issue lies with me, Rob, is that handing over your property for somebody else to have almost complete control of in times where we've got very and increasingly strict licensing regulations, across many local authorities, increasingly strict compliance legislation as well, whether that's gas safety, electrical safety, smoke alarm testings, Legionnaires, EPCs, all of the myriad of tests and compliance that's required now. When you're handing over your property, I think the owner of the property can sometimes forget that ultimately they could still be found liable, but any compliance issue, any public liability issue, if there's any safety issues there, if any of the tenants, for worst case, were injured, or you had anything more serious within the property, I'm firmly of the view that the liability would ultimately come back to the owner of that property rather than this sort of pseudo landlord that had sat themselves between you and the tenants. And I've actually been on the end of that. I've been subject to a prosecution with a local authority in the very early days of almost before anybody knew what R2R was. I happened to meet an individual who was doing exactly what I've described. It was at that time I'd issued an AST to them, and that you don't tend to see that now. There are specific R2R agreements that exist, but they fall outside of the law, and this is one of the biggest issues as well. There's some contract law there, but it's not within the Housing Act. And yeah, I was on the end of a prosecution, and I had to convince the judge in the particular case that I'd effectively had no responsibility for that property. It had been handed over to the individual concerned, and what had happened at the property should be the responsibility of theirs. And it took a lot of doing to persuade the judge, and I don't think you'd get the same answers now if that scenario arose with this current environment we have for rent to rent. And these are all the things that concern me, really. I think because R2R allows you to have control of a property with very limited capital, other than, in some cases, no more than a deposit that you hand over initially, I think there's a very much an easy money environment that's been created there. That's how people sort of see it, and I can see that from the forums that I look on, in terms of how people were on there looking for their first rent-to-rent deals, with no experience of background of property. Property is a serious business, not to be taken lightly. You're dealing with people's welfare, healthcare, and putting a roof over people's head, and something like that, Rob. You just can't leave it to chance. You have to take on responsibility, and not just look for the quick turnaround on your money from it.
So in terms of things being a ticking time bomb, then I'm guessing this approach is coming really from a, dare I say, like a true landlord's point of view, because as you say, ultimately, and the buck does stop at the landlord. I mean, I've heard stories years ago. I won't name the area or anyone involved, but I did hear a story from a meeting I was at a while ago, and there had been some form of it was either a gas leak or gas explosion or something like that. No one died. It wasn't like fatal or anything like that, but it done serious damage. And I remember the landlord saying that they'd woken up in all sorts of cold sweats and whatnot, because they couldn't remember if the agent had or hadn't done the gas safety certificate recently. It turns out everything was kosher in terms of all the certification being in place. But as you say, landlords might just hand over their properties thinking, yeah, okay, no more responsibility for me, where in actual case, regardless of what agents do or don't do, or rent-to-renters do or don't do, a court of law nowadays will more than likely say what we've just said. The buck stops at the landlord. No matter what happens, no matter what contract you got in place, it's still landlord responsibility. So that, am I right in saying it is that approach? That's why you're saying, actually, Rob, this is a ticking time bomb here, because something serious could happen, and it involves the welfare of a lot of people rather than the market completely blown up per se. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's actually now a relatively well-developed market, and what concerns me is that at the moment there doesn't appear to be enough incidences of it going wrong, whether they're just being sort of swept under the carpet. But I think without proper regulation going forward, because the whole rent-to-rent market exists in this sort of hinterland of between landlords, tenants, agents. They're kind of the rent-to-rent guys are sort of floating around between the two, largely unregulated. So they're not going to be members of ALA or any of the other real estate professional bodies. It's people are entering this market, off of a one-day rent-to-rent sort of training course by some so-called property guru, who's probably, a similar, level of experience to half the people that are sitting in front of him anyway. And they're the kind of things that sort of concern me, under this whole rent-to-rent banner as well. And I think, the other thing is, well, I mean, we've kind of touched on compliance, but the actual tenancy aspect of it as well. Listen, I've had recent scenarios of having evictions going on, particularly towards the tail end of COVID, for the best part of 2 years. So that gives you an indication of the turmoil within the court system, the bailiff system, 4 months to get a bailiff in many, certainly London boroughs. The reality is that unless the tenancies that are being granted to these individuals by the rent-to-rent operators are absolutely watertight, as they need to be, the ultimate landlord is potentially going to find themselves in a position where they've got a tenant that is likely to be there sort of ad infinitum, particularly with changes to Section 21 when they come through. There's potentially, we're almost going back to a regulated tenancy environment where somebody is granted a tenancy and they potentially could be there almost on a lifetime basis. And if you've entered into that with a rent-to-rent operator, your flexibility or options to then remove that tenant if you was to wanting to sell it with vacant possession or move back into the property, you've then lost that. You're potentially stuck with somebody in a property that you neither let it to originally, know anything about, or want there. And these are all the things that are contributing to this time bomb that concerns me.
Okay, so let's take this a step forward, because that actually plays perfectly into what I had circling around in my head. So let's just say you're in that situation and someone is in there that's X amount of rent, etc., etc. Now we've seen over the last couple of years interest rates go from, call it, anywhere between 0 and 1% up to 5, 6, 7% for mortgages. So let's just say that there's a set of landlords out there who are on these agreements or whatever, and they're in this situation where, let's just say they've got a tenant, or the rent-to-rent contract, whatever, pays £1,000 a month, and their mortgage at the moment is on £500 a month. But because of all the economic bits and bobs that are happening, they're now looking or having to refinance. And there's two elements here that I can think of. Number one, let's just say the cost of that mortgage goes to £1,500 for argument's sake, but they've got a rent-to-rent agreement at £1,000 that has no wiggle room. Well, congratulations, you've just shot yourself in the foot, because you're now going to be a mortgage prisoner. So that could create a whole set of issues, probably another reason why it's a time bomb as well. And secondly, I completely forgot what my second point was, but I'll think about it. I'll think about it in a minute. But certainly from a mortgage point of view, that's the thing that would concern me, that if you do get caught in that situation, and I know that we'll say, well, that just creates opportunities potentially for people buying. Fine, okay, I get that. But I think, as you're trying to point out, actually, if you've got a good old watertight agreement and someone is in there at a set rent that's got not a lot of flexibility, and you're a landlord and you've now got to refinance, you could now become a mortgage prisoner, and that is a time bomb in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the other important thing to consider is that mortgage terms and conditions generally, obviously, they make allowances for the property to be let on ASTs, but there's very little reference ever to the ability as the mortgagee to be able to let on a rent-to-rent agreement. You know, maybe lenders need to get wise to this, because it's clearly out there. You know, there's clearly, you know, plenty of growth in that market. But you know, ultimately, if that property, you know, ends up getting repossessed, then the lender then it finds themselves in a very, you know, difficult position, you know, when it comes to the rent-to-rent operator, in terms of how, you know, how do they physically break that agreement and remove them, you know, them or their tenants, that could well be let under ASTs on, you know, individual rooms or portions of the property. You know, how does the lender then, you know, remove the tenants and protect their security? I think lenders probably really need a wake-up call to the extent of rent-to-rent that is out there at the moment. You know, and it will probably take a test case where a rent-to-rent operator that is evicted via the courts under agreement that is not an AST. But you know, that's again, that will have to happen at some stage. You know, without to avoid, you know, lenders being exposed to this potential risk.
You also read my mind there, Chris, because that was going to be my exact second point about mortgage companies, and the agreements that were in place might go against the principles of the mortgage in the first place. So thank you for helping
Yeah.
me read my mind. So
Mm.
I guess if we're summarising, I think that what I would say is, and I agree, that sometimes when something needs to come to light, it's going to take something bad to happen in order for things to possibly get better. That's probably a good place to start. You know, I think everyone was completely horrified over Grenfell, for example, with the cladding scandal and all that sort of stuff. And I think the more that people unwrap from that, the more that's not for this podcast, but I think you get the point. I think people listening to this are going to get the point. The more you unwrap is, yeah, not good, to say the least. So in effect, let put ourselves into our landlord's shoes as we have done, in order to, I think if we're going to summarize it quickly, is to say that have your eyes open, protect yourself, and always think about what you're doing before you do it. Don't just jump in because someone's waving some paper around with you know, some guaranteed rent. You've got to think of these things, because ultimately, as you've said a few times, the buck stops with you, the landlord, and you could end up in a situation where you've just shot yourself in the foot big time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you know, there are, in all likelihood, decent rent-to-rent operators out there. But certainly, if I, you know, maybe as I sort of advance in years and look to sort of, you know, hang my property landlord boots up, you know, it might be something I will consider. But if I did, my due diligence levels would be sky high. So if I was speaking to an operator, I'd want to see examples of properties that they are currently renting. You know, I want to physically inspect them. I want to check all of their paperwork is in place. I want to make sure certainly they've got their landlord licensing in place if it's mandatory licensing for that HMO. You know, do proper due diligence on these, because the reality is there's just way too many new entrants into this market that see it as a, you know, a quick, fast buck. You know, that I think are, you know, woefully equipped to deal with the rigors of certainly managing serviced accommodation where you've got 5 tenants in the property. Also, don't forget, you know, the wear and tear on the property as well. You know, these handback agreements that say you'll get the property back in the same condition. I've had it with local authority lettings in the past. That property never comes back in the same condition. You know, your beautifully refurbished, you know, 3-bed semi, you know, will come back with a coat of magnolia, you know, and probably half the kitchen and bathroom missing in a worst case scenario. And, you know, and that's with the council. If you're dealing with, you know, a rent-to-rent operator that's, you know, offering it return to you in full maintenance, again, you don't know the level of maintenance that's acceptable. You know, you're not going to get it back quite as it should have been, you know, and that's when you start to count the pennies. You know, you would have had the benefit of that guaranteed rent potentially with no hassle, but you get a property back and you've got to spend 20 grand bringing it back up to scratch. You know, these are all the things you need to consider.
No, I think that's a good place to finish there, Chris. I think it's been incredibly insightful. I've certainly learned a lot from listening to yourself. If people want to get a hold of you, get in touch, or find you, how do people find you?
Yeah, absolutely. You'll find me in all social media platforms, LinkedIn. My profile's quite strong there, and you'll see some of the other things that I do within the property world as well. Again, across all the socials, you're welcome to my office number if you want to put a link in your bio of my bio into this podcast. That's absolutely fine by me.
Absolutely, we will definitely do that. So all your links, etc., will be in the show notes, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it'll be in the description below. Chris, well, thank you very much for your time. But say I've learned a lot from that. I think what we've covered in terms of rent to rent SA, and that area has been very, very impressive. But also for people that are looking to get started or have only just got started, again, I think the fundamental stories that you've told and the things that you've said, that again, if people follow that, yeah, a bit of knowledge and you know, growing your power team, etc., will be useful. But also, again, 9 times out of 10, it just comes down to being consistent, knowing your area, doing your fundamentals, and having good connections. So thank you for sharing that. And at some point, we'll get you back on the show, because we'll go into all energy performance certificate stuff. But that's a whole different episode. So we look forward to having you back in due course.
Yeah, thanks very much, Rob.